When the HOA president made the bold decision to evict him, she believed she was simply enforcing the community's rules, maintaining order and upholding the standards of the neighborhood. What she didn't realize, however, was that her actions would set off a chain of events that would spiral far beyond her control. With every legal notice and stern warning she delivered, she unknowingly stepped deeper into a situation that would soon consume her life. What started as routine enforcement of HOA policies quickly turned into a living nightmare, one she never saw coming. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share where you're watching from in the comments section. Your support will help us bring more meaningful stories like this. Malik Patterson had always dreamed of owning property in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. After years of hard work, he finally made it happen. The house, a stunning two-story brick home in Brentwood Estates, Tennessee, sat on a neatly trimmed lot with a wraparound porch and a spacious backyard. It was exactly what he had envisioned: peaceful, elegant, and the perfect place to settle down. A sanctuary. But something felt off from the very first day. The moving truck was still parked in his driveway, boxes stacked near the front door, when Malik first noticed it, the feeling of being watched. From behind curtains, across neatly manicured lawns, and from porches where neighbors sipped their morning coffee, there were lingering stares that lasted just a second too long. No one approached, no friendly introductions, no welcoming gestures. Just a heavy, unspoken silence. He initially brushed it off. Maybe this was just how things were in Brentwood Estates. Maybe people here liked their privacy and took their time warming up to newcomers. He hoped that, over time, things would change. That illusion cracked the very next morning. Malik had barely finished brewing his first cup of coffee in his new home when a sharp, deliberate knock echoed through the house. He opened the door to find a woman in her mid-60s standing on his porch. She was impeccably dressed in a neatly pressed beige blouse, pearl earrings, and a cardigan adorned with a small but unmistakable HOA emblem pinned to the fabric. Her posture was rigid, her expression carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something that set Malik on edge before she even spoke. "Good morning," she said, her tone clipped and professional. "I'm Barbara Whitman, president of the Brentwood Estates Homeowners Association." Malik extended a hand, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you. I know who you are," she interrupted smoothly, her gaze flickering past him into the house as if assessing something unseen. "I wanted to go over a few things." Before Malik could respond, she handed him a thick stack of stapled documents. "HOA guidelines," she clarified. Malik glanced down and quickly skimmed the pages. The rules were standard enough: strict lawn maintenance policies, specific exterior paint color restrictions, pre-approved mailbox designs. Nothing unusual for an HOA. But something about Barbara's demeanor made it clear this was more than just a friendly visit. She cleared her throat, drawing his attention back to her. "We like to maintain a certain standard here," she said, her gaze drifting pointedly to the moving truck still in the driveway. "I assume you'll have that removed by this evening?" Malik raised an eyebrow. "It'll be gone once I finish unpacking." Barbara nodded, but it wasn't a gesture of satisfaction. It was more like she was making a mental note. "Good," she said. "And just so you're aware, the HOA requires that trash bins be placed at the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." Malik frowned slightly. "I didn't put them out. The previous owners must have." Barbara pursed her lips. "I see. Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason." And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving Malik standing there with the hefty rulebook in hand. He shut the door, exhaling slowly. Maybe she was just meticulous. Plenty of HOA presidents were. He wasn't about to let one overly strict neighbor ruin his fresh start. But as the days passed, it became clear that Barbara wasn't just strict. She was watching him. A notice appeared in his mailbox about an unauthorized vehicle in his driveway, his car. Then another citation, this time about improper lawn maintenance. His grass had grown maybe an inch too high. A third violation letter arrived regarding his porch light, which, as it turned out, was the same fixture the previous owner had used without issue. By the end of the week, Malik had a small but growing collection of official-looking papers, each stamped with the Brentwood Estates HOA seal. He hadn't spoken to Barbara since their first meeting, but it didn't matter. She had made herself known. Still, he tried to keep his cool. Maybe she was like this with everyone. Maybe if he followed every rule to the letter, she'd back off. That hope quickly faded when he took an evening walk and passed a small gathering of neighbors chatting in a driveway. Their conversation died as soon as they noticed him. One woman forced a tight-lipped smile, but the rest simply turned away, and standing in the middle of the group, arms crossed, was Barbara, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. He didn't need to hear the whispers to know what they were about. This wasn't just about HOA rules. It was about him. If Barbara thought she could intimidate him into leaving, she was in for a surprise. The notices continued, each one more absurd than the last. Every morning, Malik found a fresh violation letter tucked neatly into his mailbox. At first, he skimmed them and tossed them in a drawer, but after the fifth letter in just 2 weeks, his patience wore thin. This time, the complaint was about his trash bins. Bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection to preserve neighborhood aesthetics, the letter read. Malik clenched his jaw. He had picked up his bins the same way everyone else had, after work. So why was he the only one being targeted? Curious, he decided to test a theory. The next morning, he woke early and took a slow walk through the neighborhood. By 9 a.m., dozens of trash bins still lined the curbs. Some were even overflowing with loose bags spilling onto the pavement. Not a single violation notice was in sight. Just his. Malik pulled out his phone, snapped a few pictures, and composed a polite but direct email to the HOA board. He included the photos, asking why his bins were an issue while everyone else's were ignored. He didn't know what kind of response he'd get, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to be bullied out of his own home. No response came, but 2 days later Barbara was back on his doorstep. This time, she didn't bother knocking. She simply stood there, arms crossed tightly over her chest, clipboard clutched in one hand, the other resting against her hip like she was preparing for a confrontation. Her lips were pursed, her stance firm. She wasn't here for a friendly chat. Malik, having spotted her from the window, took his time answering. He swung the door open and leaned lazily against the frame, arms folded, meeting her gaze with an air of indifference. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, voice calm, deliberate. Barbara didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow, sweeping glance over his shoulder, eyes scanning the interior of his home with a sharp scrutiny that felt invasive. It was as if she were mentally cataloging every detail, every out-of-place object, searching for something, anything, she could latch on to. Then, with a practiced motion, she raised a form between them, her nails tapping lightly against the paper. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment 1 below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. "This is a formal request for you to submit proof of home ownership," she said, her tone sweetened just enough to feign politeness. "We've had some complaints." Malik felt his stomach tighten. "Complaints?" he repeated, his jaw clenching slightly. Barbara nodded, maintaining that saccharine tone, though the sharp edge in her voice remained. "Your neighbors have expressed concerns," she elaborated, tilting her head just so. "They've noticed unusual activity. Different cars are coming and going at all hours. Multiple furniture deliveries. Some are worried that you may be renting this property out in violation of the HOA's regulations." Malik exhaled sharply, letting out a short, humorless chuckle. "You've got to be kidding me." Barbara's expression remained unchanged. He took a measured breath, forcing himself to keep his composure. "First off, I own this house. My name is on the deed. Secondly, I've been living here for less than a month. I'm still moving in. That's why there have been deliveries, and as for the cars, those are friends and family helping me settle in." Barbara's grip on her clipboard tightened ever so slightly. "Well," she said smoothly, "we have policies in place to ensure that all homeowners are properly vetted. We'll need you to submit your deed for verification." Malik knew exactly what this was. She wasn't asking anyone else for proof of ownership, just him. Still, he kept his voice even. "You can look it up yourself," he pointed out. "Property records are public information." Barbara's eyes narrowed just for a split second. Then, as if catching herself, she quickly smoothed her expression. "I'd prefer if you submitted it directly." Malik tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And if I don't?" Barbara's lips curled into something that mimicked a smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Then I'll have no choice but to escalate this to the HOA board." Malik exhaled slowly, biting back the words sitting on the tip of his tongue. She wanted him to react. She wanted him to get angry, to raise his voice, to give her an excuse to turn him into a problem. Instead, he simply smiled, slow and deliberate. "I'll think about it," he said, then closed the door before she could say another word. Barbara didn't like that. That evening, as Malik sat on his porch sipping a beer, he saw her again. She was standing at the end of his driveway, deep in conversation with a man in a polo shirt and khakis. She gestured toward Malik's house, speaking in hushed tones. The man nodded occasionally, jotting something down on a notepad. Malik didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. Barbara wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore, she was gathering ammunition. The next morning, Malik woke up to an email from the HOA. Subject: Notice of violation. The alleged issue? His porch furniture. According to the email, his outdoor seating arrangement, 2 wicker chairs and a small glass table, did not conform to the aesthetic standards outlined in the HOA guidelines. A vague rule, one that wasn't being enforced on anyone else. Malik leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had walked this neighborhood more than enough times to know that at least a dozen homes had similar setups. Some even had old plastic chairs that looked like they'd been sitting out since the early 2000s. And yet, somehow, his was the problem. He ignored the notice. A day later, another email arrived. Subject: Second notice, lawn maintenance violation. Malik frowned. His lawn was freshly cut, neatly edged and watered. He had spent the entire afternoon trimming the hedges, making sure everything was pristine. But there it was, a formal complaint stating that his grass was slightly overgrown, and a warning that fines could be issued if the problem wasn't corrected. Malik knew exactly what was happening. Barbara was trying to drown him in complaints, stacking up minor infractions until she had enough leverage to escalate things. So he decided to play her game. That evening he took a slow walk through the neighborhood, jotting down every single actual violation he saw: overgrown yards, broken shutters, faded house numbers, and trash bins still sitting by the curb long after pickup. Then he submitted his complaints, each one backed with time-stamped photos. Less than 24 hours later, Barbara was back, and this time she wasn't alone. Standing at the edge of Malik's driveway, with her arms rigid at her sides, she was accompanied by an older man with salt and pepper hair and a clipboard in hand. Malik recognized him from the HOA website, Stephen Reynolds, Vice President. Barbara's expression was tighter than usual, the forced politeness barely masking her irritation. "Mr. Patterson," she greeted, her voice stretched thin, "we received your list of complaints." Malik crossed his arms, nodding. "Good. Then you know I'm not the only one being held to ridiculous standards." Stephen cleared his throat, exchanging a glance with Barbara before speaking. "We appreciate your concerns, but the HOA board determines which issues require action. Not every minor infraction warrants a formal notice." Malik scoffed. "So mine do, but everyone else's don't?" Barbara didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out a printed form and handed it to him, and Malik knew, without a doubt, that the battle had only just begun. This is your final warning before fines are issued. Your porch furniture must be replaced, and your lawn must remain at the regulated length at all times. Malik stared at the paper in his hands, his grip tightening slightly as his eyes traced the sharp, impersonal words. He already knew what this was. It wasn't about aesthetics, and it certainly wasn't about maintaining neighborhood standards. This was about control, about reminding him that, in the eyes of the Homeowners Association, he didn't truly belong here. Slowly he lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Barbara, who stood across from him, arms crossed, her expression smug yet carefully composed. He took a slow, measured breath, forcing a tight smile onto his face. "You know, Barbara, I've read the HOA bylaws from top to bottom. Nowhere does it say that a homeowner must replace furniture that's in perfect condition." Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's a matter of neighborhood uniformity." Malik arched a brow. "So, you enforce rules that don't exist?" Barbara's jaw twitched a tiny but telling movement. Next to her, Stephen, one of the other HOA board members, shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two of them. For the first time, Malik noticed it: hesitation, uncertainty. Stephen wasn't fully convinced. That was a crack in the foundation, and Malik intended to widen. He took a step forward, his voice steady and deliberate. "Let me ask you something," he said, watching Barbara closely. "If I were someone else, say, one of my neighbors, would we even be having this conversation?" Barbara's nostrils flared ever so slightly. Stephen opened his mouth as if to say something, then hesitated and closed it again. No answer. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Malik nodded slowly, folding the violation notice in half with deliberate care. "That's what I thought." Barbara's expression barely shifted, but there was something new in her posture, a stiffness that hadn't been there before. When she finally spoke, her voice was clipped and controlled. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA has the authority to take further action." Malik met her gaze without wavering. "Then do what you have to do." Barbara held his stare for a fraction of a second longer before turning sharply on her heel and walking away, her movements rigid with frustration. Stephen lingered for a beat, looking as though he wanted to say something, but in the end he just followed after her. Malik watched them go, the crumpled notice still clenched in his hand. He had called her bluff, but Barbara wasn't the type to back down easily. And he was right. The next morning a thick envelope sat in his mailbox. This time it wasn't from the HOA. The return address belonged to a law firm. Malik's stomach hardened as he tore it open, scanning the pages inside. It wasn't a simple fine. Barbara had escalated. She had gone beyond HOA policy, beyond neighborhood disputes, straight to legal action. The complaint filed with the Davidson County Housing Authority accused him of being a fraudulent occupant. The claims were weak, but they were numerous. Allegations that he had failed to provide proof of ownership, suspicions that he was renting the property under pretenses, and vague statements that multiple neighbors had expressed concerns about his presence. No names, no concrete evidence, just assumptions and carefully worded accusations designed to bury him in legal trouble. Malik exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the paper. He could ignore it, the accusations wouldn't hold up. But this wasn't about eviction. This was about exhaustion. Barbara wanted him drowning in legal fees and paperwork, frustrated enough to walk away. She had no idea who she was dealing with. That evening, Malik picked up his phone. "Hey, Joe," he said when the line connected. "I need a favor." Joe Martinez had been Malik's real estate attorney for years. He was sharp, relentless, and twice as ruthless as Barbara ever hoped to be. By the next morning, Malik had everything he needed, and he wasn't just going to defend himself, he was going to turn the tables. 3 days later, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. The room was packed. Homeowners filled the seats, their hushed voices thick with curiosity. They had heard the rumors. They were here for a spectacle. At the head of the long conference table sat Barbara, her face a mask of composed authority. The other board members flanked her, some glancing at their notes, others looking deliberately neutral. Stephen avoided Malik's gaze. Barbara cleared her throat and lifted a printed document. "We are here to address the ongoing issue regarding Mr. Patterson's residence. Given the numerous violations and the concerns raised by our community members, "I'd like to speak," Malik interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Barbara's lips thinned. "You will have a chance to respond after—" "No," Malik said, setting a stack of his documents on the table. "I'm speaking now." A murmur rippled through the room. Barbara hesitated, then gestured stiffly for him to continue. Malik stood and held up the first document. "This," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "is the deed to my house. Legal proof that I own my home. Filed, recorded, and indisputable." A few heads turned. Some board members exchanged glances. He set the deed down and pulled out another paper. "This," he continued, "is the purchase agreement for another property, 214 Oakwood Drive." Barbara's expression flickered, just for a second. Confusion, uncertainty. And then Malik pulled out the final document. "And this," he said, letting the words settle, "is the deed for 216 Oakwood Drive, Barbara's house." Silence fell over the room like a physical weight. Malik didn't sit down. He let the tension stretch, and Barbara processed what had just happened. The woman who had tried to push him out of his home had just discovered that her own house belonged to him. Barbara's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Then, in a quiet, almost forced voice, she asked, "How?" Malik folded his arms. "You might want to check the HOA records, Barbara. That foreclosure you ignored? The property sale that went through last month? I was the buyer." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Several board members exchanged startled glances. Homeowners whispered among themselves. Barbara's fingers curled tightly around the papers in front of her. Malik tilted his head slightly, a small, knowing smile on his face. "So tell me, Barbara," he said, his voice as smooth as steel, "who's the real trespasser now?" And just like that, the entire room shifted. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The room sat in stunned silence, an almost tangible weight pressing down on everyone present. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every second stretch unbearably long. Barbara's face had gone pale, the usual veneer of confidence and control slipping away like sand through her fingers. For weeks she had wielded her authority over Malik like a weapon, dictating rules and consequences with an iron grip. But now, in a single moment, all of that power had crumbled in front of everyone. The entire HOA board, the residents and the bystanders, each one bearing witness to the disintegration of her carefully constructed dominance. Malik sat poised, his expression unreadable, yet his presence filled the room. He took his time, letting the weight of his words settle over the stunned audience. He knew the power of silence, the power of letting someone stew in their unraveling, and he wasn't done. Deliberately, he reached for another document from his neatly stacked pile, flipping it over as though revealing the next act in this already damning performance. "Now," he said, his voice steady and controlled, "let's talk about fraudulent eviction attempts." Barbara's head snapped up, the movement sharp and reflexive, a clear sign that the words had struck exactly where he intended. Her lips parted as though to immediately object, but before she could utter a syllable, Malik tapped the legal complaint she had filed against him. "You reported me as an illegal occupant," he stated, his tone measured but unwavering. "You claimed I had no right to live in my own home." Barbara inhaled sharply, attempting to steady herself, but the tremor in her fingers betrayed her. "As I stated in my report, several residents expressed concerns. Who? Malik cut in, his interruption swift and unyielding. Barbara's jaw tightened as she squared her shoulders. I am not at liberty to disclose. No names? Malik arched an eyebrow, his voice carrying just enough skepticism to ripple through the audience. That's funny, because I spoke to several neighbors before this meeting. Not one of them remembers expressing concerns. A low murmur stirred through the crowd. Homeowners exchanged uncertain glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The atmosphere in the room had begun to shift, the once solid ground beneath Barbara now feeling more like sinking sand. This wasn't just about Malik and Barbara anymore. People were starting to see it. The inconsistencies, the hypocrisy, the manufactured authority she had abused for far too long. Barbara opened her mouth, no doubt to counter his claims, but Malik didn't give her the chance to recover. You accused me of violating HOA policies, he continued, his voice gaining strength. Yet you've repeatedly ignored other violations in this community. He pulled out a thick stack of printed emails and placed them on the table with a quiet but definitive slap. I've filed formal complaints, he said, flipping through the pages one by one, about broken shutters, overgrown lawns, trash bins left out for days. Not a single one of these resulted in violation notices. He lifted his gaze, letting his eyes sweep across the board members before landing back on Barbara. Tell me, do these rules only apply when you feel like enforcing them? Stephen Reynolds, the HOA vice president, cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. I think we should take a moment to... No. Malik's voice was sharp, decisive. His eyes remained locked on Barbara. Because this isn't about HOA rules. It never was. This was about her deciding who she thinks belongs here. A sharp murmur rippled through the crowd, growing in intensity. Barbara's lips parted, and for the first time, true panic flashed across her face. Malik wasn't just exposing her. He was forcing the entire neighborhood to confront what had been happening right in front of them all along. Barbara exhaled shakily, trying to regain control. Mr. Patterson, I was simply trying to... Intimidate me into leaving, Malik finished for her, his voice flat. Yeah, I got that. Silence. The kind that stretched, filled the space, pressed against every person in the room. Then, from the back of the room, a voice broke through the tension. This is a disgrace, an older man muttered. Malik turned to see Mr. Holloway, one of the longest-standing residents of the neighborhood. The older man shook his head as he stared directly at Barbara. You tried to evict the man who owns your house? A few scattered chuckles echoed through the room. The tide was turning, but Malik wasn't finished. He placed his final document on the table, the one that would bring this entire charade to its inevitable conclusion. And one more thing, Barbara, he said, his tone almost casual. You're behind on your HOA fee. Barbara's head jerked up. That's a lie. Malik tapped the paper. I bought your house at auction, remember? That includes the debt attached to it. You owe the HOA over $3,000 in unpaid fines and fees. A fresh wave of whispers spread through the board members. Stephen adjusted his glasses, frowning as he read over the document. Barbara, is this true? He asked, his voice low but firm. Barbara's lips parted, but no words came out. She had buried herself. Malik leaned back in his chair, exhaling as he watched her flounder. I suggest you start paying up. Wouldn't want to violate any of your own rules, would you? A low chuckle spread through the crowd. Even some of the board members struggled to contain their reactions. Barbara's face burned crimson. For weeks she had tried to wield control over Malik, and now, in front of the entire HOA, her authority had been reduced to dust. Jaw clenched, she scrambled for an escape route. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, shoving her papers into a folder with stiff, frantic movements. We will revisit this matter at a later date. She shot to her feet, marching toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. But for the first time, no one followed her. Malik exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. He had won. But he knew Barbara, and Barbara wasn't the type to walk away without a fight. As she disappeared through the doorway, the room remained still. Then, bit by bit, the murmurs began. Disbelief, realization, quiet amusement. It all rippled through the crowd. Stephen Reynolds shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie awkwardly. "Well," he started, clearing his throat, "I think it's safe to say this situation was mishandled." Malik let out a short laugh. "That's one way to put it." Then he picked up his list, the one Barbara had ignored for weeks. "Since we're still here, let's discuss actual HOA violations." Several minutes passed in tense silence before Stephen finally cleared his throat, his voice firm but measured. "By a majority vote, Barbara Whitman is officially removed as president of the Brentwood Estates Homeowners Association, effective immediately." And just like that it was over, the final nail in the coffin. The room remained silent for a beat, the weight of the decision settling over the gathered homeowners. Some exchanged glances, while others avoided eye contact entirely, unwilling to acknowledge their role in the events that had led to this moment. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment 3 below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Malik, who had been waiting for this inevitable conclusion, gathered his papers and slipped them into his folder before rising to his feet. With an air of finality, he turned toward the door. "Well," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice, "that was productive." A few chuckles broke the tension, a nervous sort of laughter from those who weren't quite sure where they stood now that Barbara's iron grip had been pried away. But as Malik walked out, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, a mixture of curiosity, respect, and perhaps a touch of guilt. They had all learned a lesson that night. But the person who needed it most, she wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet, because Barbara Whitman wasn't done. Barbara Whitman had never been one to accept defeat quietly, and she certainly wasn't about to start now. The very next morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise over Brentwood Estates, Malik spotted her standing at the edge of his driveway. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood her husband, Richard, a man in his early 70s with a rigid posture, a stern expression, and an air of quiet authority that had long since lost its edge. Malik had been expecting this. He stepped onto his porch, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze steady. "Something I can help you with?" Barbara's voice was clipped, each word carefully measured, as if she were struggling to keep her emotions in check. "I want to discuss the sale of my home." Malik resisted the urge to smirk. He had known this was coming. After all, the thought of renting from him, of all people, must have been unbearable for a woman like Barbara. "I'm not selling," he said simply, watching as her jaw clenched at his response. "I've lived in that house for 32 years, she said, her voice tight with barely concealed frustration. Malik tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And yet, you never paid off the debt attached to it." Richard cleared his throat, stepping forward in an attempt to shift the conversation in a more diplomatic direction. "We're prepared to offer you a fair price." Malik leaned against the porch railing, arms still crossed. "Define fair." Barbara inhaled sharply, her patience thinning. "The same amount you paid at auction." Malik let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's not how real estate works, Barbara. You lost your house because of unpaid fees. I legally purchased it. If you want it back, you'll have to buy it at market value." Barbara's hands curled into fists at her sides, her face flushed with anger. "That's ridiculous. You're just trying to make a profit off of me." Malik's expression hardened. "No, Barbara. I'm treating you exactly how you treated me." For weeks, Barbara had weaponized the HOA's rules and regulations against him, convinced she was untouchable. She had wielded her position like a sword, cutting down anyone who dared to challenge her authority. But now, the balance of power had shifted, and she was the one left vulnerable. Silence stretched between them as realization dawned in her eyes. Richard sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. How much? Malik glanced toward the house. Given the location, the current market, and your unpaid fees, $450,000? Barbara's face twisted in outrage. That's outrageous! Malik shrugged, unfazed. Then I guess you'll have to find somewhere else to live. For the first time, a flicker of genuine panic crossed Barbara's face. This was real. This wasn't just about losing a position of power on the HOA board. This was about losing the home she had lived in for over 3 decades, the place where she had raised her children, where she had hosted countless neighborhood gatherings, where she had ruled with an iron fist. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. We'll consider it. Malik gave a small nod. Take your time. As they turned to leave, Barbara hesitated. She looked back at him, something unreadable in her expression. Not quite regret, not quite a shame, but something close. For so long she had been convinced that she held all the power, that she was untouchable. But she had been so focused on driving Malik out that she hadn't seen the real danger. Her arrogance had cost her everything. Malik let the moment sit before he spoke. Barbara, she turned stiffly. Next time you judge someone before knowing them, he gestured toward the house, remember where it got you. She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away. A month later, a for sale sign went up in front of 216 Oakwood Drive. Barbara had refused to buy the house back at Malik's price, and no bank was willing to approve her for the loan she needed. Eventually, she and Richard packed up their belongings and left in the dead of night, moving to a smaller home across town. No grand farewell, no neighborhood gathering, just silence. And with her departure, the neighborhood began to change. Without Barbara in charge, the HOA finally started functioning the way it was meant to, addressing real concerns instead of obsessing over petty infractions. Homeowners felt more at ease, no longer fearing arbitrary fines or unnecessary restrictions. Some of the neighbors still avoided Malik, embarrassed by their past silence, but others, they made an effort. Slowly but surely, the walls Barbara had built around the community began to crumble. One afternoon, Lisa Hendricks, one of the few who had voted against Barbara, walked up Malik's driveway holding a plate of cookies. She shifted awkwardly as she handed them to him. I know it's a little late, she said, but welcome to the neighborhood. Malik glanced at the plate before meeting her gaze with a small smile. Took you long enough? Lisa chuckled, a little sheepish. Yeah, it did. Malik took a bite of one of the cookies. Sweet, a little stale, but better late than never. What a story. This situation shows just how far an HOA dispute can escalate, and how important it is to know your rights as a homeowner. What have you learned from this story? Let us know in the comments below. What's one thing you'll take away from this and apply in your own life? If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us bring you more engaging stories like this.